This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Hi there, I hope you're well and you're feeling pretty good. Before I get into introducing this episode, I'd just like to reiterate how very grateful I am to you, the listener, for listening to this podcast, to be tuning in where there are thousands of other podcasts out there. Now, this particular podcast, Demystifying Mental Toughness, is approaching the 4-year mark in June this year. It's been an incredible journey for myself. The motivation behind the podcast is to make a positive difference in people's lives, and certainly, at least through Apple, the numbers actually show this. We've touched nearly 100,000 people, so if we think about it, so for every listen, if one person takes away one positive point, then we're on to a winner with this podcast, I would suggest. And then add on a few extra positive points, well, it's certainly a win-win, which for me makes the podcast well and truly worth it. Now today though, this episode, I'm going to be continuing on the topic of mindfulness and ACT, acceptance, commitment, training or therapy. I was joined by Dr. James Hegarty in episode 92. James has written a great book on the topic, and today I take a small bite out of episode 92, where James goes on to share his thoughts on how we can deal with lots of time to think in sports such as golf, as cricket, which aren't so fast-paced. You know, when we think about it, on occasions, when we've got a lot of time on our hands, we can overthink, we can ruminate, which can mean an awful lot of emotions are experienced too. So yeah, James goes on to explain a bit more about this topic, where he shares his wisdom.
I was thinking ideally it would give you lots of time to relax as well and to plan things out. But, you know, often people just worry a lot. That's the challenge about golf. It gives you too much thinking time.
Without doubt, it's funny because I go back to probably about 10 years ago when I first started getting interested in mindfulness, and I can remember doing, I think it was about 3 days from 10 till 4, where we did a mindfulness workshop. And when you arrived at the setting at 10 o'clock, you were told you weren't allowed to speak to anybody at all until 4 p.m. So for 6 hours, you were in the company of about 20 people and couldn't speak. Wow, that was really interesting and difficult. And there's similarities with that and being on a golf course when you're playing with playing partners who don't want to speak to you at all.
It's quite strange, isn't it? It's to be thrown into that is unusual because your mind just goes crazy thinking about things. And if you've done the first time I ever did mindfulness, it was in the context of learning martial art, and we had to, and the guy would make us stand for 15 minutes a day, basically facing the wall. And there were times, I was very young at the time, and I just sometimes thought I was just going crazy. You know, mind's just going everywhere. You know, I can't stand this. You know, when's it going to end? You know, that kind of thing. But actually, mindfulness is quite simple, I think, really, once you get into it, once you get after that, out of that initial phase.
When you talk about mindfulness, from my research or my reading in the past, Jon Kabat-Zinn's like one of the big sort of go-to names, isn't he, in that field? And yeah, the body scan is one piece of the jigsaw, if you like, or one little tool that I've noticed you can use. But also, from my experience, you can use your other senses. So you can use with taste and your sight and different things. So how can an athlete help themselves by potentially using some of the different senses?
Well, there's lots of different ways, and you can do I think you do the base practice. I think of it sort of like base training if you're a runner, where you do your seated mindfulness or whatever, you know, where you just do very raw mindfulness practice. I particularly like mindfulness of the breath. I think that's the best practice, where you just pay attention to the physical sensations of breathing, because what happens is your mind throws up all sorts of stuff and you just get very used to not engaging with that and just going back to the body repeatedly. And when you get a good base of this, then at any moment you can And you sort of do it naturally after a while. You sort of flick into the feeling of the breeze on your face, just the feeling in your body as you're standing there or as you're moving, or the sounds. Sounds are interesting. I also get people to practice mindfulness of sound without going searching for them, because normally, especially in the city, you'll hear a bus, a car, a truck. You'll start labeling, visualizing things. And the practice is to just let the sound be just like a physical sensation coming to you without you searching for it or labeling it. And it's a very restful practice. Here in New Zealand, we have a lot of houses have tin roofs. Might sound a bit strange, but one really nice thing about the tin roof is that it's nice to lie in bed at night if it's raining and just listen to the rain on the roof. For us, it's a sort of soothing sound.
Unless you get into the judgmental part where it's raining again.
Well, if you get into that obvious, it's raining again and it's going to be miserable tomorrow, it's easy to do that, but for a lot of it, another way of thinking about it is sunbathing. People used to do lots of sunbathing when I was a lad, and you just lie there and you'd be out in the sun, or you're going to the beach and just floating in the water, and you're just enjoying lying there, feeling the sun and the heat, which is basically mindfulness.
Yeah, definitely. Let's think about this then. So I'll change the sport. We'll go with cricket for argument's sake. And a fielders out there, they've dropped a ball, and they're going through the image again in their head, and they're thinking. So in effect, for them to bring themselves back to the present moment, okay, they can put their thoughts into the body, but also they can be like trying to feel the sun on their face and hearing the sounds of what's going on in that environment to really just bring them back to the moment.
Yeah. Just they can feel the sun on their face. They can feel the position of their body. Even look, obviously they're going to be looking at what's going on, so they're going to be aware of what's happening. And you can switch very quickly from being aware of the body and being aware of, okay, what am I paying attention to? You can have sort of the two streams going at the same time. And that mindfulness, a lot of people teach mindfulness to relax. I don't. I think that's a nice side effect. But if you do, if you are get into that mindfulness state, what happens is that you tend to relax quite naturally. So it just brings down that level of anxiety a wee bit, because you're not feeding it with your negative thoughts.
That makes an awful lot of sense. It's going to quieten the mind essentially. I'm going to take you back. So when you talked about labeling and I suppose making judgments, am I right in thinking this practice is very much just about trying to be and be very non-judgmental?
Well, we have to be judgmental sometimes, but it's knowing when to be judgmental and when to just let it go, when to not engage with that. And it's having the ability to do that. What happens is that we often, once we start going down a judgmental, especially as something about ourselves, some negative comments about ourselves or our abilities, we start to get hooked into that, and we keep going over it, and it feeds that. So it's being able to just step away from that and let that go for the time being when it's not appropriate. It's the middle of a fast-paced match. That's not the time to be beating yourself up about things or over-analyzing something that had gone wrong 5 minutes beforehand.
So when you mentioned there about over-analyzing, that seems to be a big problem for a lot of athletes, where especially, say, more technical sports, where maybe they've made a mistake somewhere and then they just replay over and over in their heads. They're over-analyzing the situation. So again, this is where mindfulness is going to really help them.
Oh, definitely, because you can just sort of step away from that, because now's not the time. After the match is the time, or talking to your coach is the time. It's once you give it of course, you might be able to do it very quickly. Fine, that's great. Analyze your mistakes, sort it. But if it's not done quickly, you need to get your head back in the game. And that's what the mindfulness is for. It's to basically learn to, well, it serves several purposes, but one of the purposes is to get your head back where it needs to be at the time. It's direction of attention, really.
Yeah. I like to think of it where athletes may have two mindsets, where they've got a training mindset where, yes, when they're practicing their technique and different things, it's fine to overanalyze, to try and understand why you're doing things wrong. Then you need to have a trust mindset when you're actually performing in competitive situations where the mind is quieter. So yeah, this is going to help them no end.
Well, again, it was lovely to hear that episode back. It certainly helped me to go over a few things in my mind. It's helped me to think about things a little bit differently there, and it's also offered me some food for thought on the podcast as a whole and the different directions that I can take it moving forwards. And without giving the game away too much, there's going to be a full-blown episode with an interview from another leading expert in the field of mindfulness coming up very, very soon. For now, though, and over the next couple of weeks, you can certainly come to expect more bite-sized chunks. However, you will see a change in the format of the podcast in the very near future. So for now, my little musings though, I'd like to broaden your mind when we're thinking about mindfulness again. Recently, I've done some CPD on the topic, and I've also had a good discussion or two with a few different colleagues on how we can actually apply this really well. So I'm going to actually take you through the journey of being a golfer. I'm a golfer personally. I play off a 2 handicap, so I'm pretty good without blowing my trumpet too much. And if I went into a round of golf where I challenged myself to be uber mindful, so to put the score to one side and just to think about being mindful, I reckon I could pay attention to my emotional state, to my attention in general, lots and lots of times. Because on the golf course, you get about 4 hours worth of thinking time there. So I'm going to experiment this on myself over the coming weeks, where I seek to be mindful and pay attention to the present moment a minimum of 100 times in a round of golf. And you might be thinking, wow, that's impressive, or wow, that is crazy. So I'm going to talk you through how I'm going to do that and what it actually looks like. So if we think about it, my routine is to arrive about half an hour before I actually play. So what I can do is when I'm driving, obviously I'm going to be concentrating on the road, but perhaps I might feel some nerves, some anxiety there, because I know the first tee shot isn't far away. So all I can do when I'm driving is simple. I can just notice my breath. I can place my attention in my breath for 10 seconds, for 20 seconds, maybe for 30 seconds, as I'm driving, as I'm concentrating on the road. And if my mind drifts back to the golf and predicting that first tee shot, going down the middle I hope, then I'm just going to divert myself back to my breath. I'm not going to judge myself whether I've done the task well or not. I'm just simply going to bring myself back. Then on arrival, when I'm getting my gear out of the car, rather than rushing around and doing it really fast, I could decide that I'm actually going to spend a good few minutes doing this. And again, I'm going to be very mindful along the way when I get that bag out of the car. So as I do so, I'm going to be using my senses. I'm going to be using my touch. So I'm going to gently rub the grooves of my clubs with my fingers. I'm going to be rubbing my golf bag. Whilst I do so, I might use my ears. So hearing the sounds of the birds in the background, I could use another sense, which I suppose again links back to touch. This time would be feeling the cold northeast wind blowing on my face. So now that I've got myself ready, got my gear ready, and I've done 30 seconds or so of mindful activity there, I'm ready to go on the putting green. And again, I just want to douse some of those flames of nervousness. And I can do that by simply standing over a putt for about 2 minutes. That's right, 2 minutes. And I'm not going to be rigid as I stand there. I'm going to be trying to relax into this. I'll be feeling the texture of the grip. I'll be noticing the tightness of my grip, perhaps trying to loosen it off. Whilst I do so, I might be looking at the dimples on the golf ball, hearing the birds singing again, maybe even dialing into my breath a little bit. And again, when I notice my thoughts come along, predicting what I'm going to do on the first tee or what my score's going to be, or whether I'm going to start holding some putts, I'm just going to be non-judgmental. I'm going to recognise I might feel a bit nervous, but I'm not going to judge whether the nerves are good or bad. I'm just going to let them go. I'm going to douse those flames by going back to the grip, by again looking at the dimples on the ball, maybe even thinking about the texture of the ball in my hand if I was holding it. I might notice the grass and the grain of the grass, which way it's going. There might be some leaves blowing around, and again I might just feel that cold wind, or maybe the feeling of the sun, hopefully, on my face. Now I get on to the putting. So I get on to do some longer putts, and then some holing out some shorter putts. But as I do, I break up my putting practice there, bit by bit, with some mini stretch exercises, where I raise my toes off the ground about 1 centimetre. I do this for 10 seconds or 20 seconds, and I pay attention to the stretch in my leg. Have some more putts. Maybe this time I raise my heel of one of my feet off the ground a little bit. Again, just paying attention for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, grounding myself, remaining calm. Then my routine would be to sign in the pro shop, and it would be to hit some balls in the net. So again, rather than just bashing balls, I go into the net, or if I can't, I'll find a quiet spot, and I might stand there with the golf club in my hand, again for a minute or two, undisturbed. I might close my eyes, noticing my breath. Then I'll notice my weight, whether I'm on my toes and the balls of my feet, or my heels. Might notice if I'm leaning to the right or the left ever so slightly, depending on the club. I might even play around with this and go on a slightly uphill or a downhill and notice what it is I'm feeling in my body. I'm not judging whether any of this is good or bad, I'm just simply feeling and noticing whilst breathing. And again, I'm noticing the wind on my face. I hit some balls, but every now and again I do some of these mini stretches again that I talked about earlier on the putting green. And then so on and so forth. I continue to do this for maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then I'm ready to go on to the first tee. So the round begins, and I keep doing this time and again when I get opportunities. Now, I've got to admit I am a social golfer. I do like having a chat with my playing partners. So I'm not going to be doing all this mindfulness stuff all of the time. I'm going to be having a bit of a laugh and enjoying my game of golf too. But when there's moments where I can douse those flames of nervousness or quell the adrenaline and excitement after getting a number of birdies, I hope, I'm going to be going back to my body. I'm going to be checking in with my breathing. I'm going to be grounding my feet, especially maybe when I'm on the green, when I've got a minute or two to play my putt and I'm waiting for my playing partners. It might well be that when I'm walking down fairways, ideally I'd be with my playing partners, but sometimes that's not the case. So I'd be looking at the trees, the tree tops, noticing the texture of the leaves, the colours of the leaves. If there's flowers there, again the colours. Looking at the scenery in the distance and paying attention to it, the different colours of the fields or the shades there in the background. I might be looking at the clouds or the lovely blue sky, again with a bit of luck. So I'm doing my best not to think about the past and that possible double bogey or birdie. The reason for doing this type of exercise or continually doing these exercises is I want to try and remain in neutral gear as long as possible. I don't want to be thinking whether I'm going to finish 2 under par at the end or over my handicap. I just want to keep bringing myself back. And as I say, I reckon I could do this over 100 times no problem. Possibly even 200 times in a round of golf. And this is no bad thing. You know, if I set my goal to be able to do this, rather than going round and shoot a 69 or a 70, it's certainly not going to be a bad thing, because I think the 69s and the 70s or the 71s will actually come potentially as a result of this, because I'm going to be more relaxed, I'm going to be more trusting of myself and the way I go about things. Now I'm talking about doing this in a competitive round. We can do this when we practice too. We can do this away from the golf course. And you know, the more we practice it, the better we get at this. And when the pressure's really on, that's right, when the heat is really on and you're feeling stressed, when you want to go really low or off the back of mistakes, and whether this is golf or another sport, it means that you can perform an awful lot better and perhaps play with more of a smile on your face. That's my aim anyway. So yeah, look, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's given you a little bit of an insight into what you can do with mindfulness. To some people, it'll seem a little bit airy-fairy, but I'm going to give it a bash, and I'm certainly going to try it out with some of my clients in the near future too. I've used a lot of these exercises on a smaller scale, but if we're going to take this really, really seriously, there's no reason why we can't really immerse ourselves in this. Anyway, look, until next week, where there's going to be another bite-sized episode, I hope you have a great week. Please do sign up to the Mental Edge newsletter. It's going to have more information on this type of topic, as well as other useful topics that will give you an edge on your performance. It's going to help you reflect and refine your approach, just as I'm thinking about doing with the podcast as we move forwards. So yeah, get signed up to the Mental Edge. The details are in the show notes. Have a wonderful day ahead, and perhaps a mindful day ahead. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources.
The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.